Good morning, friends. We are continuing with our discussion of how to work with people based on Swami's wonderful little book, The Art of Supportive Leadership. Let's begin with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we offer our lives in service and devotion, in gratitude for all the great blessings you have showered upon us. Help us to serve your work with willingness, creativity, humility, and joy. We are your children. Bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. So we are in the last part of the chapter called Leadership is Not an Ego Game. So Swami says, leadership then must be focused on the job to be done. Your own role in the completion of a task should not be the focus of your attention, however vital that role may be to the task itself. I was thinking about if you're painting a picture, you're looking at what's on the canvas, and your thought, if you're going to be successful, is how these lines are working together and how these colors are flowing together and how this composition adds or subtracts from what you're doing. And if we become self-concerned and if our mind wanders to all the other things that might happen, the job simply can't get done. I'll use my example from writing because it was very interesting. This was during the period of time when I couldn't. And I was writing about Swami Kriyananda in the early 2000s. And we had just finished these 12 years of litigation, and we had been under enormous criticism. And there were a few specific individuals that I knew well who were former members of Ananda who had been extremely strong voices in that criticism. And during the period of time when I was entirely non-productive, even though I was trying, even as I would write something, I would start thinking about the person who was going to argue with me about it, and I would start arguing with them in my mind, and then I would feel my arguments were inadequate, and then I would erase. I would delete what I had done, and I would start again. I was never thinking about what I had to say. I was constantly thinking about how the world was going to respond to it, whether other people would like it, whether this person, even not just my big critics, but even friends, how they would respond to what I was doing. In other words, I never could focus on the job at hand. I only focused constantly on how everything was going to affect me. Just calculating my own position in it. And as a consequence, I was actually productive. Absolutely not at all. I literally worked for a couple of years, not full time, but a lot of time, and had literally nothing. It was really quite impressive. Because I could never forget myself enough to actually just concentrate on the project. It was so dramatic. So think about one's reality when you're sitting in a meeting, when you're having a conversation with someone. Where does your mind drift to? And of course, why does your mind drift? But that's a whole different question. But where does it drift to? And that will tell you a lot about whether you're going to be effective or not going to be effective. The greater one's mental emphasis on himself as the doer, the less he will be able to accomplish, whether as a leader or in any other capacity. The greater his mental emphasis, on the other hand, on the job to be done, the more likely he will be to succeed. Am I thinking about all the different ways the creative and the fun ways that we can make this work. Where is my mind going? I learned this in a positive way when I was given the job of cooking in the Ananda retreat in my very early years. There was a lot of interesting factors about cooking, and I'm going to say this because it's like, what are the steps to being able to be free of self-concern? One of the ways that I began to learn to be free of self-concern, more free, I don't want to overstate it, was that when I was doing things that I was capable of doing that I didn't consider inherently that important. Sort of an interesting fact, but it was a good way for me to learn. I grew up in an intellectually oriented family, and of course my mother made meals for us, we all ate, but cooking was not an art form that my mother was even slightly interested in, and my father, they were very traditional. I can't honestly think I can ever see my father doing anything in the kitchen in all the years that I lived there. But cooking just wasn't important. It wasn't important to my self-esteem. It wasn't important to my self-worth. It just wasn't something to be taken seriously. This was also before the era, before cooking was taken so seriously. But so as a consequence, I'm running this kitchen, and of course I really had to do it. It was very important to do it. But it wasn't about my self-worth. Those are the words. And it just wasn't hard. It was mechanical. I just got the food, I cut the vegetables, I boiled them, I put them out. I mean, I was a terrible cook, and I gradually did learn to cook, but I could just do it for the fun of it. And there was no anguishing, what will people think, quality going on. It was also one of the reasons that Swami was able to awaken my intuitive understanding of cooking. And I've never been able to write this story into a book because I could never find the principle. The closest I've come is simply this. My ego was not dependent on my being a good cook. And therefore it didn't interfere with Swami's capacity to open up my intuition because I wasn't anxious. Whereas writing, it actually took, 30 years for me to really get to the point where I could write because my self-worth was so invested in being able to write. But at a certain point, and I'm not this free yet, but at a certain point, I saw that writing too was just something I could do. And it wasn't about whether I was a good person or a bad person or whether Master would greet me with a smile or a scornful, wave of disdain. It was just a job that had to be done. And if I put out enough energy, if I just followed the patient application of willpower, step by step, soon it would be done. These are very, very, very long life lessons that I've been working on for decades. So merely for me to be able to say, this is how it goes, does not mean you'll be able to do it in the morning. But Swami puts it so absolutely clearly. The more you think about your own role, the less you're going to be any good at your role. The more you just think about, we're here to get the job done, let's get the job done, the more likely you are to succeed. Well, that's the end of the text of that chapter, and Swami summarizes to recapitulate the rules given in this chapter. Number 1, self-importance in a leader is self-defeating. So even what we hope to accomplish by making ourselves important, we're not going to get. This is the paradox. If you wish to be everything, strive to be nothing. This is St. John of the Cross. That's his wonderful poem. Number 2, the spirit of a group reflects the spirit of its leadership. That's helpful in countless ways, including the fact that if the spirit of your group is terrible, you have to ask yourself, what am I doing that is allowing this to grow? Number 3, the ego can either be a hindrance or an aid to creativity. It is an aid if its energy flow is toward the job to be done rather than inward upon itself. Calculating one's own advantage, that's what you have to get over. Your own advantage in the situation isn't the point. What will help this to succeed? Number 4, remember leadership is not an ego game. Okay, moving on to a wonderful chapter now, which is called Leadership Means Responsibility. I was extremely happy to see this title. It's interesting because my entire spiritual education has come through Swamiji and the experiences that Ananda has provided me, but the single pointed source of my understanding has always been Swami. And so many things, when I read through his books, which I've read them all when they were written, and I've read most of them more than once, I'm having the experience now, which I may have mentioned, that I'm recording an audiobook of Swami's book, which used to be called Crises in Modern Thought. It's now called Out of the Labyrinth of modern ideas that are leading us to have the attitude that life is meaningless. This is a book that Swami did not write for devotees. He wrote it for people who aspire to find more meaning in life, but are caught up in Western philosophy and don't know how to reconcile the inner aspiration of the heart with the nihilistic philosophy of the times. This hits college students especially hard because this kind of meaningless nihilism is all pervasive on a lot of our college campuses. So I read Crises when it was published in 1972, and I've read it probably at least a few times since then. But now I'm recording an audio book of it, and I haven't read it in many years, and by the grace of God, I've changed over those many years. I've had more life experience, I've paid more attention. So I'm reading this book into a microphone, and when you do an audiobook, well, every little experience can be the microcosm of the macrocosm. And I've recorded audiobooks before, the books of my own that I wrote, several of them, including most recently Light Bearer. And the process of recording an audiobook is an act of spiritual faith on many levels, and it's a sadhana, a spiritual discipline, because you have to absolutely concentrate. You have to concentrate on every single word, and you have to know exactly what you're saying, and you can't let your mind wander. Because if you let your mind wander, one way or another, the person listening is going to feel the energy disappear. You might still be saying words, you can still be reading the words on the page, but if your mind is over here, all the magnetism comes out of those words. And in the case of this particular book especially, where sometimes the meaning is very complex, if I lose my focus while reading it, even for a moment, I don't have any idea what I'm saying. I'm just reading words across the page. So it's been marvelously fun, and as I said, it's a wonderful spiritual discipline. One more thing that I learned with Lightbearer, just because I'm talking about this. This is about the job to be done, which was, when I read, because my mind is quick and because I've just trained myself over many years, I'm not a speed reader, but my eyes are always seeing the words that are coming. So even if I'm on reading a particular word, my eyes see the words that are coming. But if you're doing an audio book recording, if you do that, then the word that you're saying only has part of your attention. So you have to just see the word that's right in front of you that you're saying, which I realized, and this is Lightbearer, the book that I wrote. As I'm reading this word, I have to believe that there's going to be a word after it. And that may sound a little funny, but it was actually a real committed act of faith, that I don't need to anticipate reality. I can just be in the now, and the future will take care of itself. Now, having said all of that, which is much more than I intended, about reading Crises in Modern Thought, I always have to call it by the name that I knew it, Reading Out of the Labyrinth. It's been very interesting to me to realize how many of these ideas I have integrated into my way of presenting Swami's teachings. I don't remember when I learned them, because I don't remember learning them from this book. But Swamiji himself would be expressing these ideas over a lot of time. And spirituality, you see, we think, and I'm going to use the word spirituality, but we're talking about leadership. Any skill that we have, we imagine that we put it on from the outside. And that is a little bit what Swami was talking about in the last chapter. Now I'm a leader. I do these things now because now I'm a leader. But if we just put it on from the outside, it's a costume that I have put on, and there's a slight bit of a disconnect between who I actually am. And inasmuch as we were talking in that first chapter, and we'll be talking more through this book, true leadership is magnetism. And magnetism is the actual vibration of your consciousness, not the face you give to the world to try to impress it, or the rules that you've memorized about how you're supposed to behave. You know, it is none of that. Magnetism is how you vibrate, who you really are, and it can't be faked. And everything on the spiritual path, Swamiji talks about this in many different places. True spirituality grows like a seed from inside yourself. And you don't gradually look more like a spiritual person. You gradually begin to vibrate more like a spiritual person. The idea that it grows like a seed, Jesus said faith is like a mustard seed, which is that it can be very small, but the entire potential is inherent. And all you have to do is provide the right opportunities, and that inherent potential will simply burst out of it. We, in this house, we often grow sprouts, bean sprouts and alfalfa sprouts and mung bean sprouts, and it's so just marvelous. You just put this seemingly inert object, this little tiny little green mung bean, and you just give it a little water, really just a little water and a little warmth here and there, and then you come back and this thing that just wasn't there is just bursting out of it. Like without anybody, it doesn't require a great intellectualization. It just bursts out of it. So what we're trying to do, if we're going to be magnetic leaders or spiritual devotees, is we're not merely trying to memorize the rules. We're trying to deeply reflect on who do I want to be and how do I get there. Of course, I'm teaching this book in the context of the whole Ananda way of life. Swami wrote it as J. Donald Walters, so it could be used by American corporations where it has been used quite a bit. And so a person recognizes that once you begin to transform yourself, it's a separate study to learn the art of self-transformation in a spiritual way. But it's taking the ideas deeply into ourselves. And that's why it was so gratifying to me to be reading Out of the Labyrinth. And even though I have to concentrate very hard to understand when he talks about Jean-Paul Sartre and Kierkegaard and Kant and moral absolutism and things, vocabularies I've never used before, or let me say that are not part of my normal life. But the ideas, somewhere along the line, like a seed inside of me, a lot of the ideas, they've just been growing because there was the desire to do that. Now, all of this is coming because I read the title of this chapter, Leadership Means Responsibility. And recently, prior to my taking up this subject, for some reason I've had a lot of conversation with different people about leadership, which is part of why I was doing this. And I was talking about Ananda leadership, because of the way that Swami has trained us, because of the example he set, by the continuing example that Jyotish and Devi have set, which is, the spirit of the group is a reflection of the leader, so it is the spirit of Ananda. Ananda leaders do not lead because of their position. They may have a position, but they do not lead because of their position. They become leaders, or they are effective within Ananda as leaders if they're willing to take responsibility, and then if they have the right magnetism in the way they take responsibility. Leadership at Ananda is magnetism and the willingness to take responsibility. Taking responsibility is not unique to Ananda by any means. I think I said this earlier, I think it was Henry Ford or some other well-known American industrialist who said simply, the hardest thing to find is people who will take responsibility. You can find lots of people who will accept the position and the money that goes with it and the status and everything else, but to actually find people who will take responsibility. In the course of my experience with Ananda, when people will say, nobody gives me creative jobs, I don't ever get anything interesting to do, and so on like that. My answer always is, whatever job you're given, do it as well as you can, and then I say, make yourself indispensable. In other words, just become such a committed person to the situation and be creative. Don't just be a Shudra. Don't just wait to be told and stay within the parameters of what's already been done. If you are really responsible for it, if this is really my responsibility, then we're always looking beyond. And anybody who comes into Ananda, I have seen, and it's the only corporation I have any experience with, who is really willing to take responsibility, everybody wants them. Everybody wants them to work with you. Because I know from my own position, when there's somebody in my community, in our community here, who I know if I ask them to take care of something, it will be taken care of. I don't have to ask a week later if it's still being done, and I don't have to ask if it'll be done well. It might not be done exactly the way I would do it, but that's much less important than that it be done with magnetism and commitment. Leadership is taking responsibility. I mean, that's really the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. So, genuine leadership demands a sense not of glamour, but of responsibility. The true leader is concerned not so much with the opinions of others as with the truth, with getting a job done, with inspiring others to join him in working toward a worthy common goal. In the early years of Ananda, when things were so complicated in so many different ways, and so simple and primitive in other ways, let's see. And this was long before you had cell phones to take lots of pictures. So there were just a few people, really literally, who could afford cameras and could afford film and could afford to get the pictures developed and all the things that were required. But there were a few. So the very earlier pictures, photographs of Ananda, there aren't that many of them. And there's certain iconic images that just say everything. One of the founding members of Ananda is a man named Ananta. He's called Ananta now. He happens to be physically on a rather grand scale, well over 6 feet tall and a very powerful person, brilliant mind. I don't think he graduated from Stanford, but he attended Stanford, and in his case, that was because he really deserved to be admitted. He lived on that level. And but his real passion was gardening, and he also knew how to do things in the physical material world. But he was also a spiritual leader right from the beginning, a deep meditator, all these things. There's a photograph, and in the photograph there's this great big hole in the ground, and then there's a piece of heavy equipment. We had a backhoe where you could dig holes in the ground. So there's the backhoe there's this huge hole in the ground, and it's just dirt, and the water in the hole in the ground is muddy because something is coming up like this. And probably, if you put it together, the backhoe was digging and hit a water pipe and broke it. That's almost for certain what happened. And in the water, up at least past his hips, which tells you the water was pretty deep because he was pretty tall, with his hands, in the mud, doing whatever he needs to do, Ananta is just there with the biggest smile on his face. And I've heard someone talk, and I don't know if it was about that exact moment or what it was. The water pipe broke, everybody's standing around trying to think of what to do, and then Ananta steps into the water. Because somebody has to step into the water. That's the next thing that's going to happen. There's no way this is going to happen without somebody just getting into the mud like that. And I know him well. I'm sure he didn't hesitate. Oh, somebody has to get in the water. Wow, why not me? And every time I see that picture, it's perfectly symbolic to me. Leadership is taking responsibility. We're just going to do it. This is what we're going to do. And we're going to decide that it's not hard to do. We can do this. When I was living at Ayodhya, which is the section of where Crystal Hermitage is at Anand, it was the monastery at that time. Let's see what it was. We had a spring there. And somebody decided that the way to make the spring work was to fill, and the spring was like maybe 8-foot square. I am not at all adept on the physical plane in this respect. I don't understand exactly where or what the spring was, but there was like an 8-foot hole, 8-foot cubic probably down. It was taller than our head. And somebody decided the way to make the spring work well was to fill it with gravel. So I believe we were part of the time of filling it with gravel. We, meaning the group of women who lived over there, who were just not that strong. But I remember this hot summer day, I believe we filled it. This was all 45 years ago. We filled it with gravel. And then somebody else determined that filling it with gravel was a really bad idea. So then this same group of girls had to go back down in that 8-foot hole and take all the gravel out. And, it was just like, but there it was. It just had to be done. And so how was it going to get done? It was going to get done by us. So we just went out there and did it. I remember another time, these are all just silly stories, but at the Expanding Light Retreat, there were 2 sets of chairs, and one of the chairs were yellow and the other chairs were brown. And they were almost identical, except they were different colors. And all the brown chairs were in the temple, and all the yellow chairs were in the dining room. And one very hot summer day, and hot was like 100, more than 100 degrees, very hot weather. On Sunday afternoon, I come there, and Haridas, who was again one of the founding members, is moving like the 150 chairs in the temple. He's moving them in the dining room, and the 150 dining room chairs, he's moving them into the temple. I sort of looked at it, I said, Haridas, what are you doing? He says, exercising. And then he points to his rather chubby physique. He says, getting some exercise, I can really use it. And then he says something like, somebody thought it was a good idea to switch the chairs. But if they don't like it, the next time they can switch it themselves, he said. And then cheerfully, he just carried back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Leadership is taking responsibility. These are mundane tasks, but how often, does the leader hope that someone else is going to take it for him instead of really accepting that what happens here really depends on me? Now, of course, that doesn't mean you monopolize, and Swami will talk about this. You have to get other people involved and give them meaningful work, or else they just feel like serfs. But it's just, I don't hesitate. This has to be done. I will solve it. That is leadership. Okay, my friends, God bless you.